I want to begin with a story that sums up my theory of journalism. It's very short. It was 1991. I was very young. I was 21 years old. And I was trying to work as a freelance reporter in newly ex-communist St. Petersburg, Russia. And I heard a hot rumor. After decades of deprivation, gorillas in the city zoo were finally going to get bananas. And I thought Western editors would go crazy for this. They'd already turned me down for all these other negative stories about heroin coming and gun violence. Bananas sounded more positive. So I went to the zoo, and with some difficulty, I interviewed the zookeeper. And after that, I did what journalists do and hung around the gorilla cage looking creepy for a while until I mustered up the courage to bother a few strangers and ask them their opinions about both gorillas and bananas. Some of the ex-Soviet Russians had funny answers. One said, well, nobody's giving me bananas. And when that man on the street portion of the exercise was over, I remember having this thought, well, I can't interview the gorilla, so that must mean it's time to go home. So I went home, wrote up the story, filed it, got rejected, but that's not the point. The point is, journalism isn't rocket science. It's not supposed to be that hard. You're a middleman, you go, you talk to a few people, you give your best version of what you think just happened in front of you. You attach a catchy headline. In that case, I think it was, we do have bananas, but that didn't work. And then when you reach the, there's no one left to interview but the gorilla moment, you move on to the next thing and you leave it in the past. It's not supposed to be a deep exercise. So 30 years later, this is the end of last year, I was in San Francisco looking at piles of content moderation requests sent to Twitter by the FBI's Foreign Influence Task Force. Now, obviously, the degree of difficulty had gone up a little bit, but basically it's still the same job. And you could think about it in terms of tech company gets very unpleasant bananas if you want. But basically it's the same thing. You interview people, you give your best impression, you move on. But I learned a trick over the years, which was if something about a story doesn't make sense, if it feels like it doesn't fit, then you've probably made a factual mistake somewhere. Something doesn't add up. You should always worry about that. That inner voice inside you should always concern you. And something about the Twitter files felt off. Now, it wasn't hard to understand why the FBI was organizing a censorship scheme or why companies like Twitter or Facebook or Google might be going along with those schemes rather than face increased regulation or the end of very lucrative subsidies. The motives of the powerful actors in this story were never mysterious. The part that didn't compute for me, and didn't for a very long time, was why so many people in the general public were accepting of the situation. And this included a lot of people I knew. A lot of people in this country are okay with censorship. They think it's not only appropriate, but desperately needed. And I grew up in an America that balked at warning labels on records. And I was very influenced by organizations like Nadine Strausson's ACLU. I grew up a political liberal. The people I knew were as proud of having fought to let Nazis march in Skokie as they were ashamed that the FBI and local police forces had spied on Martin Luther King literally until the day of his death. But suddenly the same political contingent that had those thoughts in the 70s, 80s, 90s, even the 2000s at the beginning of the Iraq War, suddenly those same people were completely okay with having the government not only running mass electronic surveillance schemes of the sort that was unveiled by Edward Snowden and some others, but also a highly sophisticated censorship operation of the type Michael and I and Barry Weiss and Lee Fong and some other reporters found in the Twitter files that involved the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and 20 or 25 of the biggest tech companies in America. Why were people okay with this? That part just did not make sense to me. I really struggled with this. And for months, I thought about it until a few weeks ago, I read a draft of a new book that's not yet out by Greg Lukianoff and Ricky Schlott. Greg Lukianoff is from FIRE, and I'll be talking to Nico Perino of FIRE in a moment. But their book is called The Canceling of the American Mind. And in it, they quote the famous Justice Learned Hand, who wrote this in 1944. "Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can even do much to help it." And Justice Hand had a very hard time defining this thing, this spirit of liberty that lies in the hearts of men and women. But as an American, I believe I experienced that growing up. I think I thought I knew what he meant. As Nadine said, it's that right to not remain silent, which I believed almost religiously growing up. It was something fiery and motivational that was in all of us, and which I felt gave me an advantage over people who grew up in other parts of the world. In fact, later, when I had the opportunity, I was very fortunate to be able to travel all over the world as a reporter. And when I met people who had come from less free societies and weren't taught in the same way to stand up for themselves or for their rights, I felt sorry for those folks. And I noticed also that they'd been trained to feel deference towards people with money or celebrity and power in a way that many of us in America are not trained to believe. I was proud that I'd been taught to not be impressed by kings or princes. But that instinct, that natural inclination to freedom is waning in this country. And this was the element of the Twitter Files story that is the hardest part of the story, but needs to be understood. Now, many in this room this week, I assume, are celebrating Judge Terry Doughty's decision in the Missouri v. Biden lawsuit. Right? Tremendous news. Does everybody agree? Yes. Okay. So this is a landmark decision in a lawsuit striking down government censorship on the internet. But if that spirit of liberty that Justice Hand talked about dies, what I worry about is that no amount of lawsuits or congressional hearings will bring it back. It won't matter what the courts say. If that thing in us is allowed to pass away, then we can't bring it back by fiat. Lukianoff and Schlott in their book talked about how just as mankind, a person's natural inclination is to slouch, society's natural inclination is to censor. And if that's true, the last few hundred years of our history, a history of defiant political movements and astounding scientific innovation and vast outpourings of great music, art, literature, movies, even stand-up comedy, it would all be an aberration. So why do we want it to end? What's going on in American society that makes people want to turn away from that? And again, I spent months thinking about this, sort of lying awake as I was doing these Twitter file stories, trying to make that make sense. And I came around to the idea that Americans are not just being censored, but I believe there's an equivalent effort on the front end of internet culture to try to rob people of their will to be free. And here I'd like to do something corny and sort of ask people to indulge me for a moment and just close your eyes for a second. And imagine that instead of Google, in the near future, we invent an internalized search engine, something that would allow, for instance, our thoughts to move a cursor. And a thought occurs to you. What was the name of that dumb road trip movie that I saw 25 years ago with Dom DeLuise and Burt Reynolds and Farrah Fawcett in it? And mixed in with your own memories come mechanized search engine results, and just as it would at home instantaneously with Alexa. The answer flashes before your eyes. It's Cannonball Run, of course, right up there with Citizen Kane as one of the great movies of all time. And what a wonderful thing that would be, just to have a brain that sort of worked interchangeably with the entire internet. By the way, you can open your eyes now if anybody actually closed them. But so now imagine that instead of trying to remember a silly movie, it's something much more serious. And let's just say you're walking down the streets of Washington and you visibly encounter a demonstration in front of the White House. And it could be anything. It could be a gang of Boogaloo Boys, or it could be people from the Green Party, or even representatives campaigning for Robert F. Kennedy Jr., anybody. And in this new Everything app, and by the way, they're building what they call Everything apps, and deploying them in different countries around the world already. Instead of flashing labels for harm or age-inappropriate content, this new app would just tinge certain images it found dangerous with the same warning colors that animals use in nature to distinguish danger, like yellow and red stripes. So those protesters that you look at would be bathed vaguely in warning colors, and they would appear to you a little bit like poisonous insects, and you would steer clear a little bit. Then, when you mentally tried to process what you were looking at, once again, you would call up search engine results, and you would get a string of condemnatory headlines, along with a whole series of words that would be thrown at you. And these would be words like fascist, extremist, anti-vax, whatever it is. These are the verbal equivalents of black and yellow stripes. They don't mean anything. They're just designed to make you have a Pavlovian emotional reaction. Threat, bad, move away, recede. And with this app, let's say you also have internalized access to communication services like texting, Zoom, Signal, that sort of thing. In that situation, would you capture the image and post something on social media? Probably not. Likely as not, you wouldn't, unless it would be to attach a negative comment, which you would do instinctively at that point, not logically. You wouldn't work it through, but you would add a negative comment because you'd be doing it in search of a dopamine hit of return affirmation that the internet has already proven to be very expert at delivering. In fact, Sean Parker, the inventor of Napster, once was talking about Facebook and how it was inevitable that even people who wanted to maintain only face-to-face relationships would go on Facebook. And he said this, he said, we need to sort of give you a little dopamine hit once in a while. So it's an addiction. This is a process of getting people addicted to reward and punishment, reward and punishment. And this seemingly far out situation I'm describing that would happen entirely inside your head in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, say. This is really not that different from what people already experience. We lean more and more on machines to do our thinking for us. And the worst part is we increasingly do not distinguish between thinking that is ours and thinking that is someone else's. And we Americans once cherished independence. We lived off folk tales about people who went off on their own and hit the open road. Think about heroes of our great works of art, people like Ishmael or Huck and Jim, even figures like Chuck Berry, right, who picks up a guitar and sings a song about setting off with no particular place to go, and this creates a dazzling sound that, touches the nerve around the whole world. Well, we don't do that anymore. Now, instead of giving the world something invigorating and freeing like rock and roll, we're exporting mass neurosis and fear. At home, we've become afraid to walk even a few steps without our electronic helpers. For most of us, our senses of self are inextricably tied to a huge global entourage of prying commentators who live in those phones of ours that are always in our pockets. They're in everybody's pockets here, right? And whose good opinion we never stop seeking, whether we admit it or not. This was never us before. We've long celebrated the individual, In America, we celebrate the individual even if the individual is crazy. One of my heroes growing up was a guy named Plenty Wingo. Has anyone here ever heard that name? Plenty Wingo was famous for trying to walk around the entire world backwards. He made it from Santa Monica to Istanbul. And I remember telling this story to somebody once because I was so fascinated by it. And the person looked at me and said, "Why would anybody do that?" And I kind of scrunched up my nose and said, "Why? Because that's what we do, you know, and that's what Americans do. We do, just for the sheer sake of it, we do crazy things. It's why, you know, for every 50 lunatics who throw themselves off cliffs with homemade wings and to their deaths, we have a couple of Wright brothers, and that's kind of the system in this country. It sort of works out for us in the end. The line between outpatient and inventor here has always been super thin, and it's the same thing with the line between con artist and marketing genius. People call P.T. Barnum both. Outlandishness, difference. We've always celebrated those qualities, whether it's Mr. T or Hunter Thompson or Liberace or Patrick Henry. I mean, it's basically all the same personality. We always upheld that kind of thing. But thinking for yourself is hard work. And in conclusions, it's sort of in the Twitter files, what we discovered is that the political interests in this country in the internet age have learned to prey on another very American instinct, which is laziness. They have built sophisticated programs that begin with the premise that the internet always punishes difference and always rewards conformity. And this is the core principle at work at shadow banning and de-amplification programs. These automated surveillance programs look for phrases like open-minded, or I like to do my own research, or I'm generally apolitical. And they don't score the people saying those things as tolerant, creative freethinkers. What the algorithms instead detect is that this is a person harboring a dangerous willingness to embrace unorthodox ideas, to look at the forbidden thing and not flee immediately. And so that person is downgraded or deny-listed, and you will see less of that person's speech, and that person will see less speech, conversely. This is even scarier in some ways than actual censorship because it's undetectable in many cases. We just take people who are of a certain bent, the same bent that we once celebrated. These are the people who are the heroes of our society, and we've turned the volume down on them. We've made it so that you don't hear them as much. They're not as visible. They don't participate as much in our society. It was once a virtue in America when people asked about their politics to say, "None of your business." Well, nobody thinks that way anymore. Young people, especially, are worried to the point of mental illness about their likes and their ratios. And they, like a lot of adults, not only want people to know what they think, they're terrified of people not knowing what they think, lest they be suspected of harboring something unsavory underneath. This is something I observed when I lived in the former Soviet Union, that people who had lived under communism had learned that it was dangerous to be quiet, that silence was often an indicator of secret unorthodoxy. So there was a lot of babbling that went on. People learned to babble, constantly talk, constantly profess their belief in this or that, so that they wouldn't be suspected of thinking too much. And that's something that happens on the internet. It's increasingly part of internet culture. And this is how it is for Americans just trying to be themselves now. First, they became addicted to the internet as a tool of convenience. Then it became a cheap substitute for real-life interaction. And finally, they learned to submit to the wisdom of crowds, which on the internet, as we increasingly found out, especially through the Twitter files, is often an artificial representation of a crowd generated by political and social engineers, be they from the FBI, the DHS, the Pentagon, or from the engineers at places like Meta, Google, or Twitter. These groups are sicking their algorithms on that independent spirit of liberty Justice Learned Hand talked about. And if they can preemptively extinguish that fire, formal censorship will become unnecessary. The population will become too fearful of difference to ever risk such punishment in the first place. And I think that moment is close at hand, and that's why I'm so grateful that events like this are still happening. I think, and it's why I'm so grateful for people like yourselves. I think most of the people in this room know the patriotic importance of maintaining that spirit of liberty and preserving it and fighting for it. When I was a kid and I saw in Washington the statue of Thomas Jefferson and, the quote that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, I didn't know what that means, but he was right. We do have to be eternally vigilant, and this is the moment where we have to show that vigilance. In closing, I would just say those people who would have us glued to our phones, these people that we've seen over and over in these otherwise secret email conversations, who want us to be part of this algorithmic system of dialing down the freethinkers and dialing up the conformists. These people want us to be perennially afraid of whispers. They want us to not be proud of ourselves and stand up for ourselves and our rights. To me, these people are as American as redcoats, and we need to find a way to send them home for good. So thank you. And I'm going to sit with Nico and talk for a minute. Thank you so much.